In the Jura Mountains of Switzerland, in a region where winter arrives early and stays late, and the snow does not retreat until May, there is a town called La Chaux-de-Fonds. It sits at nearly 1,000 meters above sea level, surrounded by pine forests and pale limestone ridges. And for most of the year, its skies carry the color of old pewter. It is not, by any stretch, a glamorous place. There are no grand cathedrals here, no palaces, no promenades lined with orange trees. What there is, and what has always been here, is something more durable and more important: the willingness to sit still and do extraordinarily difficult work. The town was built on patience and precision, and those two virtues, so often described as virtues of limitation, turned out to be the foundation of one of the great industrial cultures in human history. And from that culture, one man would emerge to create something the world had never seen before: a watch that proved beauty and precision were not opposites. They were the same thing. The soil in this part of the Neuchâtel canton is thin and unforgiving. The growing season is short, the winters long and expensive in firewood and patience. The farmers who tried to work the land generation after generation found that the land would not cooperate, and so the people of the Jura valleys found a different trade. They turned inward to their workshops, to the tiny mechanical worlds they could assemble on a bench, to the art of making objects so small and so precise that the eye can barely follow what the fingers are doing. By the early 19th century, the watchmaking culture of the Jura Mountains was not merely an industry. It was a way of life, a shared language, a form of communal identity that gave even the poorest families a claim to something remarkable. A skill that money alone could not buy, a knowledge that had to be earned hour by hour in an apprentice's cold workshop under the scrutiny of a demanding master. In a society without inherited capital, this knowledge was everything. It was the only currency that appreciated with every year you spent refining it. Children grew up handling watch components the way children in farming villages grew up handling tools. The mountains had made their choice for them, and the choice had made the mountains famous. This is where Constant Girard was born on March 12, 1825. Not into wealth, not into the comfortable households of the great Geneva watch merchants, with their warehouse inventories and their London agents and their formal portraits. Constant was born into the working culture of the mountains, a family of craftsmen in a town of craftsmen, where status was measured not by what you owned, but by what you could make. His childhood, by the accounts that survive, was happy in the way that childhood spent inside a living tradition are always happy. You know what you are for, you know what you are being prepared to do, and the path forward is clear, even if the destination remains, for a long time, invisible. He began his training in the manner of all serious watchmakers of his era, as an apprentice, placed under the care of a master craftsman from the nearby village of Lassagne, deeper still in the Neuchâtel mountains. The master's workshop would have been spare and cold during the short winter days, lit by whatever pale northern light could be coaxed through small windows, the bench covered with the instruments of a trade that demanded more from the human hand and eye than almost any other craft in the world. A pocket watch movement in the mid-19th century contained upward of 150 individual components, many of them smaller than a grain of rice. A single misaligned pivot, a shaft no thicker than a human hair, could cause a watch to lose 2 minutes a day. In a world beginning to organize itself around railway timetables and telegraph dispatches, 2 minutes was no longer a trifle. 2 minutes could mean a missed connection, a failed transaction, a collision on a single-track line. Precision had become a moral obligation, not merely a technical ambition. The young craftsmen learning their trade in the Jura Mountains in the 1830s and the 1840s were learning to be accountable to a standard they would never be able to see directly: the standard of time itself. The training was physical in ways that are difficult to describe to anyone who has not done it. You learn to feel through the tips of your fingers whether a wheel was flat, learn to hear through a jeweler's loop whether the beat of a balanced spring was even, learn to judge tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter by nothing more than the resistance you felt as components came together. Constant absorbed all of this, but he also began, quietly, to exceed it. What made Constant different from the other young men learning their trade in those cold mountain workshops was a question he kept returning to: not just how to make a watch work, but how to make it work better than anyone had previously believed possible. Not just how to assemble a movement within the tolerances that satisfied a master, but how to push those tolerances further, how to manufacture the kind of precision that seemed almost supernatural when demonstrated against a standard clock. These questions, deceptively simple on the surface and technically profound in their implications, would consume the next 6 decades of his life and, in the process, fundamentally alter the watchmaking world. But in the late 1830s and early 1840s, they were simply the private obsessions of a young man bending over components too small to hold without tweezers, listening to his master correct him in the manner of masters everywhere, without patience and without apology. By 1845, still only 20 years old, Constant had completed his apprenticeship and joined forces with a watchmaker named C. Robert in the modest collaborative arrangement common among craftsmen of the Jura valleys. 2 sets of skills, 1 workshop, a combined output sold through the merchant networks operating out of Le Locle and La Chaux-de-Fonds. The work was honest, the income modest, and the arrangement was, for someone of Constant's temperament, always going to be temporary. He was not building toward a modest life. He was building toward an answer to a question he could feel more clearly every year but still could not quite put into words. In 1852, at the age of 27, he made his first decisive move. He established his own workshop under the name Girard-Perregaux, working alongside his older brother Numa. This was not yet the storied manufacture that would one day fill the display cases of world expositions and receive commissions from emperors. It was a small operation in a mid-sized mountain town, run by a young man with large technical ambitions and limited capital. But Constant Girard had something that capital cannot manufacture: a precise idea of what excellence looked like, and an absolute unwillingness to settle for anything short of it. He had also accumulated, in the years since his apprenticeship, a reputation among the people who had seen his work as a maker of unusual and sometimes unsettling ability, someone who finished to a standard that was, by the common measure of the trade, entirely unnecessary. That unnecessary standard would eventually become the only standard that mattered. The La Chaux-de-Fonds of the early 1850s was a remarkable place to build this kind of reputation. The town was becoming the gravitational center of Swiss watchmaking, drawing skilled craftsmen from across the Neuchâtel region and exporting movements to the great retailing houses of London, Paris, and New York. Competition was intense and unsentimental. The established Geneva houses maintained their traditional condescension toward the mountain craftsmen, whose work they were often happy to resell under grander names. The large merchant families controlled the distribution channels. To build an independent identity in this environment, to have your name mean something beyond the name on the merchant's invoice, you needed to produce work of quality so evident that it announced itself without an intermediary. Constant was building toward exactly that. He simply needed one more thing to make it possible. Her name was Girard-Perregaux. She was born in 1831 in Le Locle. the watchmaking town a few kilometers from La Chaux-de-Fonds, into a family whose standing in the Swiss watch trade was the precise complement to everything Constant lacked. The Perregaux family were not makers, they were merchants, and in the mid-19th century Swiss industry, this distinction carried enormous practical consequence. Making watches required skill, patience, and a hand trained to tolerances invisible to the naked eye. Selling them at scale across multiple continents to customers whose languages and customs and commercial expectations were entirely foreign to a craftsman from the Jura required something entirely different: commercial intelligence, international connections, and the gift for reading distant markets and anticipating their needs before the competition arrived. Marie's father was himself a well-regarded chronometer maker, which meant the family occupied a rare position in the Swiss trade. They understood the technical side of the craft as deeply as any maker, and the commercial side as well as any merchant. Growing up in that household, Marie had absorbed both ways of thinking about what a watch was, what it needed to do to be worth making, and what it needed to be to command a price. When she and Constant began to build a life together, she was not simply the connection to a commercial network. She was a genuine intellectual partner in the project he had been working toward his whole career. Her brothers, François, Henri, and Jules, were already demonstrating this gift at scale. François had identified an opportunity that most European merchants had not yet recognized. In 1859, he established a commercial presence in Japan, a country in the early stages of its extraordinary transformation from a feudal society into a modern industrial power, suddenly open to Western goods after 2 centuries of deliberate isolation. Henri went south, opening a dealership in Buenos Aires in 1865, tapping the commercial energy of a South American continent, building railroads and cities at astonishing speed. Jules worked the North American connections. Together, the Perregaux brothers had mapped out a commercial geography that most of their contemporaries in the Swiss watch valleys had barely imagined visiting. They were not following demand. They were creating it in markets that had not yet fully understood what they wanted. When Constant Girard married Marie Perregaux in 1854, he entered a partnership that would make everything he had ever wanted to accomplish possible. Here was a craftsman of the very first rank joining with a family whose reach extended from the pine forests of the Neuchâtel Mountains to the ports of Yokohama and the counting houses of Buenos Aires. In 1856, 2 years after the wedding, Constant formally renamed his manufacture. Following Swiss tradition, the workshop became Girard-Perregaux. The 2 family names merged into a single entity, the precision of the maker joined to the reach of the merchant in a way that neither could have achieved alone. It was, by the customs of Swiss commercial society, a rational arrangement. What it produced was anything but ordinary. This was more than a name change. It was the articulation of a philosophy, the belief that technical mastery and commercial ambition were not competing priorities but inseparable partners. A watch could be supremely precise and supremely desirable at the same time. The maker's art and the merchant's network served the same master, the person who wore the watch every day and whose life, in some small but real way, was ordered by its accuracy. This idea, which sounds simple stated plainly, was actually a genuine departure in the watchmaking culture of the 1850s, where the technically serious and the commercially sophisticated had always moved in separate orbits. Constant was proposing to collapse that separation entirely, and he had the marriage, the network, and the skill to try. The timing of the Girard-Perregaux founding appears, in retrospect, almost uncannily well calibrated to the historical moment. The railroad had transformed punctuality from a social virtue into an economic necessity. By the mid-1850s, hundreds of thousands of passengers were boarding trains every day across Europe and North America, and every single one of them needed to know when the train left and how long the journey would take. The telegraph was shrinking the world's sense of distance while expanding its need for synchronized time. Businessmen in London needed to know what time it was in New York, and the only way to manage that synchronization was with instruments of genuine precision. The great powers were modernizing their armies and navies, and modern military operations required timekeeping that would have seemed fantastical to a general of the Napoleonic era. Ships navigating by longitude needed accurate chronometers. Artillery officers coordinating fire across miles of terrain needed synchronized watches. Governments that wanted to project power across oceans needed precision timekeeping at every node of their military apparatus. In every direction Constant looked, the world was becoming more dependent on knowing exactly what time it was, and the demand for precise portable timepieces was expanding faster than anyone in the Swiss valleys had previously projected. The commercial network the Perregaux brothers had built was perfectly positioned to move through those markets. The question was whether the work was good enough to deserve the reputation being built around it. Constant was working, in the back of his workshop, on an answer that would settle the question for a very long time. The problem he was working on concerned the tourbillon, the most celebrated complication in watchmaking, and the one whose technical prestige he believed was being systematically wasted by the way everyone else was using it. Abraham Louis Breguet invented the tourbillon and patented it in Paris in 1801. Breguet's invention addressed one of the most fundamental challenges in portable timekeeping: the effect of gravity on a movement carried vertically in a pocket. A balance wheel oriented vertically for hours at a time is pulled by gravity in ways that introduce tiny positional errors into the rate of the escapement. So a watch runs slightly fast in one orientation and slightly slow in another. And over the course of a day, these errors accumulate into seconds of inaccuracy. Breguet's solution was to mount the entire escapement inside a small rotating cage that completed one full revolution every 60 seconds. By continuously carrying the escapement through all vertical positions, the cage averaged out the gravitational errors over each minute and eliminated their accumulated effect. It was one of the most ingenious mechanical inventions of the modern era, a problem of physics solved not by removing the source of error, but by making the error repeat so regularly that it cancelled itself out. The tourbillon had been the pinnacle of watchmaking complexity for 50 years by the time Constant began thinking seriously about what to do with it. What troubled Constant was not the mechanism itself, but the way every maker in the world was housing it. In every tourbillon he had ever examined, the cage turned in permanent darkness behind a solid plate. You closed the case over it, wound the spring, and trusted that the mechanism was performing as advertised. The person who owned and carried the watch had no access to the wonder inside. They were asked to accept it entirely on faith. The craftsman's greatest achievement was permanently invisible to the person it was designed to serve. Constant found this indefensible, and not merely on aesthetic grounds. It struck him as a failure of the craftsman's fundamental obligation. If you had made something extraordinary, you owed it to the person who wore it to let them see it. The answer he developed over the better part of a decade, working through multiple iterations, refining and discarding, building and rebuilding, was both technically revolutionary and visually unprecedented. He designed the movement around 3 long parallel bridges, arrow-shaped architectural elements that ran across the movement plate in perfect geometric alignment, their polished surfaces catching and returning light, their symmetry giving the movement the quality of a formal composition. These bridges held the movement's components in their precise mechanical relationships, but their deeper function was to open the movement entirely to view, to create an architecture in which every element was visible from above, in which the mechanism performed its functions in full sight rather than in darkness. Between and beneath those three bridges, you could see everything, every wheel, every pinion, every jeweled bearing, the tourbillon cage itself turning its slow, inevitable revolution. The mechanism was not hidden. It was the point. He first demonstrated this movement publicly in 1867, entering it in the annual precision trials at the Neuchâtel Observatory, the most demanding accuracy competition in Switzerland, adjudicated by scientists whose standards were those of the astronomical clock rather than the jeweler's shop. Constant's three-bridge tourbillon achieved a first-class result. More significantly, the precision record his entry established that year would remain unequaled for 17 years. Not 5 years, not 10. 17 years the record stood, in a field where every major Swiss manufacturer was competing fiercely for exactly this distinction. The watchmaking world had two things to reconcile simultaneously: the most beautiful movement anyone had ever seen in an observatory competition, and the most accurate. It took years for the full implications to register. The three-bridge movement also did something for Girard-Perregaux, standing that no advertisement could have manufactured. When a watch holds the precision record at the Neuchâtel Observatory for 17 years running, the merchants and collectors who populate the upper reaches of the trade pay attention. They stop asking questions about the maker's origins and start asking about availability and price. The condescension of Geneva, so present in the early 1850s, softened considerably after 1867. You cannot look down on someone whose work has just beaten yours in the most rigorous technical competition in the country, and you cannot afford to ignore him when the same work is being sold in Tokyo and Buenos Aires. Constant had done what the underdog of every era must do. He had made himself impossible to dismiss. He had done what the conventional wisdom of his trade had declared impossible, made the most accurate movement in Switzerland and the most beautiful one at the same time. And the two facts were not coincidental. They were expressions of the same underlying logic. Because the movement was visible, every component had to be finished to a standard that concealed movements had never required. The bridges, polished to a mirror surface, would expose any imperfection in their geometry to anyone who cared to look. The wheels, turning in plain view, had to be cut with a precision that darkness had never demanded. Visibility created a standard. The standard produced precision. And precision, when it was visible, was indistinguishable from beauty. This logic, circular, self-reinforcing, and uniquely constant, would become the philosophical engine of everything the house would build for the next 150 years. Then, in 1880, came a commission that would push Constant in an entirely different and historically transformative direction. Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany wanted watches for his naval officers. The newly unified German Empire was building a modern fleet, and its officers needed precision timekeeping suited to the physical demands of service at sea. A pocket watch on a chain was impractical when a man's hands were occupied with navigation instruments and signal equipment. The Kaiser wanted timepieces that could be worn on the wrist. Girard-Perregaux accepted the commission and designed 2,000 watches in 14-karat gold, chosen not for luxury, but for its resistance to seawater corrosion. Wire lugs on each side of the case allowed the watches to be strapped to the wrist on a metal bracelet. A grilled metal cover protected the crystal from the hazards of shipboard life. The watches were manufactured, delivered in 2 batches of 1,000, and put on the wrists of German naval officers. They were the first mass-produced wristwatches in history. The wristwatch, the object that billions of people now wear as a matter of daily habit, the object that has organized the hours of more human lives than perhaps any other single invention, was born not in a research laboratory, not from a corporate strategy, but in a mountain craftsman's workshop in La Chaux-de-Fonds, as the practical answer to a military commission. The wristwatch commission of 1880 sat somewhat apart from everything else Constant had done, in the sense that it was driven entirely by someone else's practical requirements, rather than by his own technical obsessions. But the Kaiser's commission forced him to solve a different kind of problem, a design problem, an ergonomic problem, a problem of how to make a precision instrument survive conditions it had never been designed for. And in solving it, without fanfare, without apparently understanding what he had set in motion, he pointed the entire industry toward its future. Not one of the original 2,000 has ever been found. When Girard-Perregaux eventually wanted to display one in their museum, they had to reconstruct it from the original workshop drawings. The watches are gone. The fact of what they inaugurated is not. Through the 1880s, Constant continued the refinement that had always been his mode of operation. The three-bridge movement was redesigned again. The bridges took their final form, broader arrows with splayed, elegant ends. The nickel silver of the original design was replaced with 21-karat gold, completing the movement's transformation from a technical instrument into an object of deliberate artistic ambition. In 1884, Constant secured a United States patent for the three-bridge architecture. He was in his late 50s, and he was thinking carefully about what would outlast him. In 1889, Paris hosted the Exposition Universelle, the World's Fair, whose entrance was the newly completed Eiffel Tower, and whose ambition represented the 19th century's most spectacular attempt at self-presentation. Every significant watchmaker sent their finest work to compete. Constant Girard sent the watch he had been building toward for 30 years. He called it L.A. Esmeralda, named for the Parisian jeweler Hauser, Ziwi and Compagnie, who operated the La Esmeralda shops in Paris and Mexico and were appointed to market the piece after the exhibition. The watch housed the perfected tourbillon with 3 gold bridges, the movement now at the absolute peak of its development, the arrow-shaped gold bridges gleaming above the exposed mechanism, the tourbillon turning with the serene mechanical confidence of an object that has been made exactly as well as it can possibly be made. On September 29, 1889, the jury of the Paris World's Fair awarded La Esmeralda the gold medal. The citation acknowledged not only technical achievement, but something harder to name: the quality of vision that had made this object a new kind of statement about what watchmaking was for. Not simply accurate, not simply beautiful, both simultaneously and so completely that the distinction between the two ceased to mean anything. After the exhibition, La Esmeralda passed through channels history has never fully documented into the possession of General Porfirio Diaz, then the President of Mexico. The watch disappeared from the record entirely. For 81 years, one of the most celebrated objects in watchmaking history was simply gone, held by the heirs of a head of state somewhere in Mexico, while the watchmaking world continued without it. Then, in 1970, a co-owner of Girard-Perregaux, traveling in Mexico, was contacted by one of Diaz's descendants, who offered to sell the famous piece. The transaction was completed at a price that remains undisclosed. La Esmeralda came home to La Chaux-de-Fonds and has occupied a place of honor in the Girard-Perregaux Museum ever since. It is the most famous watch the manufacturer ever produced, recovered from a century of obscurity, its 3 gold bridges still as bright as the day they were polished for the Paris jury. Constant Girard died in 1903 at the age of 78. He had worked in watchmaking for more than 50 years, and the record he left behind was, by any fair accounting, extraordinary. He had founded an international watch manufacturer from a small mountain workshop with no starting capital beyond his own trained hands. He had set a precision record at the Neuchâtel Observatory that stood unbeaten for 17 years. He had created the first mass-produced wristwatch, an invention whose significance the world would spend the next century catching up to. He had secured a United States patent for the most recognized movement architecture in watchmaking history, and he had won the gold medal at the Paris World's Fair, with a piece that watchmakers still study today as one of the fundamental statements about what the craft can achieve at its highest level. The company Constant built would go on outlasting him in ways that compounded with time. In 1965, Girard-Perregaux engineers developed a high-frequency movement beating at 36,000 vibrations per hour, a technical achievement that many experts consider the last genuinely useful advancement to the mechanical watch movement. In 1966, all 40 of the company's entries in the centenary competition at the Neuchâtel Observatory passed the trials, and the observatory awarded Girard-Perregaux something it had never given anyone before in its history, a special centenary prize. The man who had held the precision record for 17 years in the 19th century had founded a house that was still setting standards in the 20th. In 1971, the manufacturer introduced mass-produced quartz movements running at 32,768 Hz, and that specific frequency became the universal standard for quartz timekeeping, adopted by the entire industry worldwide. 3 times in history, across 3 separate centuries of technology, Girard-Perregaux established a standard the whole world followed. The full meaning of what Constant Girard built is not visible in any single achievement. It is visible in an idea so thoroughly embodied in his work that it eventually stopped seeming like an idea at all and started seeming like a natural law. The watchmaking world of his era operated on a foundational assumption that precision and beauty were competing priorities. The technically serious movement lived in darkness, doing its mechanical duty, indifferent to how it appeared. The visually beautiful case lived in light, pleasing the eye, indifferent to what it contained. 2 separate domains, evaluated by entirely different standards, were rarely spoken of in the same sentence. Constant rejected this completely, and not in words. He rejected it in metal, in the geometry of 3 parallel bridges, in the decision to make visible what every other craftsman had chosen to hide. The 3 bridges movement was the most precise in Switzerland, because it was designed to be seen. The requirement to expose the mechanism demanded a level of finish that hidden mechanisms had never needed. The beauty and the precision were not separate achievements. They were the same achievement, expressed in different registers. Making the movement visible was not a concession to aesthetics at the expense of mechanics. It was the mechanical discipline expressed as aesthetics. The 2 were inseparable because the logic that required one required the other. You could not have the beauty without accepting the standard. You could not have the precision without building the beauty. The tourbillon, with 3 gold bridges, has been in continuous production since the 1860s. The movement architecture Constant Girard established in that cold mountain workshop, 3 parallel bridges, an open plate, the tourbillon visible in its rotating cage, has remained essentially unchanged for more than 150 years. It is, by any reasonable measure, the oldest watch movement still being manufactured and sold anywhere on Earth. Every piece that leaves Le Chaux de Fonds today carries inside it the geometry of a young man's obsession, the lines of a movement first imagined by someone who had every practical reason to think small and chose instead to think in terms of forever. He started with nothing but skill and a question. The question was, What if a watch could be the most beautiful object in the room precisely because it was the most accurate, not beautiful despite its accuracy, but beautiful through it and because of it? He spent his life answering that question in gold and steel, in cold workshops and world expositions, in a precision record that stood 17 years, and in 2,000 wristwatches that no one can find today. And the answer is still being manufactured in the same town, under his name, more than a century after he laid down his tools for the last time. His name is on every watch, not because it was given to him, but because he built it, one bridge at a time, in a mountain town where the winters are long, the standards are absolute, and there is no such thing as close enough.